So what I would like to do in chapter 1 of our episode today is to trying to ease you into understanding what it means to look at problems from a social psychological perspective and trying to see how we can change them, not only using social psychology as a means to changing behavior, but also to trying to understand what the cause of that problem might be. So let's start with one problem. As you remember, the first step of all our intervention is always trying to identify a problem that is worthwhile investigating, a problem that's worthwhile changing. And one thing that's really worthwhile changing is people's experience of their commute. So you might not have realized it, but commute is one of the biggest contributors of misery in the industrialized world. So here's a large study. Here's on the bottom left, slightly obscured by my face. You can see a quote from a large-scale study published in Science that has the following finding. Holding all else equal, commuters have lower life satisfaction, have a lower sense that their daily activities are worthwhile, lower levels of happiness and higher anxiety on average than non-commuters. There's something in our daily lives, in most of our daily lives, that causes anxiety and a feeling of lower satisfaction with our life and less meaning. So that seems to be a real kind of good cause in trying to change that. So we have a problem. So now you can think about how would an engineer think about it, right? An engineer would think about, we have to increase the commute. Maybe we can kind of build faster tracks so we can cut down 5 minutes so people have less misery. And a clinical psychologist might think like, maybe we have to get people out there. We have to reduce it as much as possible that they're exposed to the situation. A personality psychologist would ask, well, maybe it's just certain types of people who suffer and others not, and we come back to that. So what would a social psychologist do? Well, as you saw in our first from our first episode, I talked about this study. I talked about this study from Kahneman and Deaton that basically finds that money does not have that impact on happiness that we always think it has. But once you earn a certain amount of money, money doesn't really matter anymore. But from a social psychological perspective, the most important thing about this study was that the biggest contributor to our happiness, the biggest contributor to feeling less stress, more meaning, and more happiness in our lives is feeling connected to others, having a social connection. Social isolation causes misery. So now if we kind of think about back about the commute, right? There are basically kind of two types of behaviors you can do on a commute. One thing that most people do, that is they kind of isolate themselves, socially isolate themselves, right? They want to, please don't talk to me. If you ever were on a tube, then you have experienced that we all look down, we don't, on a London tube that is, we all look down, we don't talk. It's like a very kind of lonely situation. So as a social psychologist, you think like, what they need more social interactions. What they need is they need to talk to people. They need to get into contact with people, right? It's a very unique perspective we have here as a social psychologist on these things. So here's a study that exactly did that, right? So what they tried to do, Apley and Schroeder in this study cited below there, is that they had 3 different groups of participants. So this was done in Chicago. We're on Chicago is a large commuter town. So in America, most towns or cities, it's better. Most cities are organized in a way that people live outside and then commute inside. So this is exactly what they kind of took advantage of in the study. It was in Chicago, and they recruited participants before they were boarding the train to commute into work in Chicago, and they divided them in 3 groups. In one group, they said, you have to socially isolate yourself. You have to be on your own, right? You're not allowed to talk to anyone else. Please be on your own, okay? The second one is that they ask people to make contact. So all of them, I should have said that in the beginning, all of them got, I think, a Starbucks £5 gift certificate if they were willing to participate in that study. They were willing to participate in that study. The second group was asked to try to make a social contact, to talk to a person next to them or on the other side and engage in a conversation with them. That's the group that the social psychologist would be excited about, right? We would predict that that would kind of help them to have a more enjoyable experience while commuting. And And the third one was like just a control condition, where it's like, just do whatever you do normally. You don't have to change anything about your commute. And at the end of their commute, when they left, they had to fill out how much they enjoyed their commute, how much positive feelings they had during their commute. So here you see the results. Let me kind of highlight first on the y-axis, you see the positivity. So the higher the score here, so this is like the more positive feelings you had during your commute, right? And then you see the three groups on the y-axis. These are two studies, the results from two studies from experiment 1 and experiment 2. And in each of them you see, here it's a little bit like that people who were in a social connection condition, they reported the highest positive feelings, okay? And those who were in the solitude condition were had the lowest, or they shared the same here in experiment 2, right? But you can see clearly that people who had a social connection, that they experienced the commute as most pleasant, more pleasant than any other, right? So here we have something where we look at a phenomenon such as commute, and social psychologists offer a unique perspective of how we would change it. Think about what I told you in our first episode, in our first session, when I talked about the achievement gap between winding participation students and other students, okay? So think about how a social psychologist kind of approaches that. You think like, oh, what is the social dimension here? They don't think, oh, maybe it's like one group is smarter or more motivated than the other. Or they think about, oh, we have to change the society, the structure, and so forth, okay? No, they think, what is the social cause of that? Why do these students feel, what could be the social contributor to lower achievement and winding participation students? That is the unique social approach we have, right? So the first step often when we identify the problem is to think about, okay, what could be uniquely social about this, right? Sometimes this is obvious, like you have something about mental health and stigmatization. Sometimes it's not as obvious, right? Most of the time when we think about commute or we think about student achievement, we make it about the individual. We make it about infrastructure. We make it about society. And we don't think about the social character. But what we are trying to do is to say, okay, we think that humans are social animals, hypersocial animals, and we have to take that serious, right? Now, think about kind of like, I think Rory Sutherland, I'll post that link in our next episode when we talk about vice interventions, but he has this fantastic talk where he thinks, okay, when we take that perspective serious, when we think about how we actually, what we experience, then we come to very different conclusions than we are having right now. So often governments all around the world are spending billions and billions to cut minutes from commutes. They improve the tracks, they install faster trains, here the Eurostar, they build tunnels just to maybe cut it down by 20 minutes and so forth, right? Because they think it's so terrible, you have to cut it down. But imagine you would have like a uniquely social psychological perspective and somebody gives you $1 billion and says like, how can you increase the enjoyability of the commute from outside of London, inside of London? And what you do is like, okay, how can we increase the social connections? Maybe we have in special in some special coaches, what we have is Hollywood stars who engage with others and get people to talk, right? That would be much cheaper. You can have a new Hollywood star every week on the train and you would pay them insane amount of money. But overall, that would be much cheaper than increasing the infrastructure or improving the infrastructure, right? This leads us to a very different approach when thinking about how we should handle situations if we take that social psychological perspective serious.